Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. We are looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus, and we're studying this chronologically, going through it in order Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and looking at the life of Jesus and his teachings. And we're still on the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew 5 through 7, and we're getting toward the latter part of that. We're now into Matthew 7 today. And today we're looking at Jesus' teaching about judging others. And he starts out in Matthew 7, and most of our focus is going to be Matthew 7, 1 through 6. Most of what's in Luke 6, 37 through 42 is paralleled with Matthew, so we're going to spend most of our time in Matthew. But he starts out and he says in verses 1 and 2, he says, "Do not judge others, and you will not be judged." And we got to pay attention to this. "For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard for you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged." That ought to scare a lot of us because I know personally, all right, I can be very bad about judging others and excusing the things that I do. And so I just want us to think about that and go through think about that as we go through that. And he continues on. He says, "Why worry about a speck in your friend's eye?" Right? Something like a little tiny thing, little tiny speck in your friend's eye, when you have a log in your own. How can you think of saying to your friend, "Let me help you get that speck out of your eye," when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite, first get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. And so he's given us some common sense type of advice here that we should really pay attention to, but oftentimes we don't. Oftentimes we're too worried about what other people are doing because we don't want people to be able to see what we're doing. And so Jesus is telling us here to examine our motives and conduct in judging others. And so we need to be careful about that because what I've learned and what most people have learned, and you've seen, and I've seen it a lot, is the traits that bother us are often, or I'm sorry, the traits that bother us in others are often habits we have ourselves. A lot of the things you'll point out, or you'll make sure to point out about other people, are the same things that you deal with or struggle with, and you just don't want anyone to see it. So you can easily identify it. So you make sure to point it out in other people. So our bad habits are in our behavior patterns, right? Are the very ones that we want to charge with others. The first, I've seen this a lot. I've seen this, I think anyone who's followed anything in the Christian world, you've seen this from the pulpit a lot, right? You've seen a lot of preachers who might harp on a particular sin, and then you come to find out that that particular preacher or pastor or whatever you want to call him is guilty of that particular sin. And so we've got to be careful because sometimes what we harp about the most is what we're guilty about the most as well. And so we got to be guilty, or I'm sorry, we got to be careful about how we are judging people or approaching people on their sins when we have those same sins ourselves. And so this is not a blanket statement to overlook wrongdoing, though, and we got to be careful of that because a lot of people will use this as an excuse, like, "Oh, well, don't judge me. The Bible says you can't judge me," and that's not the case, right? This is just warning us that it says, "Do not judge others," and you will, it's about how we're judging people, right? And how we're not to overlook wrongdoing. We're told to encounter wrongdoing, but you got to make sure that you've got yourself put together first and that you're cleaned up first and that you get the entire log that's in your eye before you go dealing with someone who's got a minor infraction, right? And that's what he's talking about. And so we are to look at things that are wrong. We are to bring up sins that are wrong, but we've got to do it in a correct way. And that's why he says the standard that you use for judging other people, you're going to be judged by as well. So hopefully you're really forgiving. And because if you're going to want in judgment day, you're going to want Jesus to be very forgiving of you as well. And so again, it's not saying that if someone's struggling with something or someone's sinning that we don't go to them, but we don't just sit back and judge them, right? We don't just sit back and try to call them out and do it in a way where it's like, "Well, look at me, I don't do these things," but that's the type of judgment we're talking about, not the type of where we go and help someone. And so in verse 6, right, he ends it with saying, "Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls and then turn around and attack you." And so him using this analogy, pigs were unclean animals, right, according to God's law in Deuteronomy. So his people that he was talking to knew this. And anyone who touched them were unclean and became unclean. And so he's using this as an example of someone who's unclean. Don't waste your time. Don't throw what's holy to them. And he's talking about, like, teaching to them, and I think part of this is kind of a dig at the Pharisees, which Jesus, would do every once in a while, kind of poke them a little bit. But right, he's saying that we need to entrust what's holy and the holy teachings, not to unclean people. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't teach and we don't preach to people who are not Christians, because that would go against everything else he's saying. But what he's saying here, right? It's futile to try to continue to try to argue or debate, or continue to try to bring people to people who don't want anything to do with it at all, no matter what, right? And in fact, they're going to tear you apart or come after you. And this is why I'm not a big fan of people who like to just debate non-Christians and go after, or not, I say go after, but just constantly try to bombard non-Christians with proof and with evidence and stuff like that, because that's not going to work, right? You're not going to be able to convince someone just by arguing with them or pointing out what they're doing wrong or trying to do. They're not open to the scriptures, and you arguing with them or you trying to prove them wrong is not going to win them over. Showing them love and kindness and mercy will. And that's the core of the Bible, and that's where it's at. You can teach them the Bible later, show them Christ first, and then teach them Christ later. And I think that's the format we looked at. And so, like I said, we shouldn't stop giving God's words to unbelievers, right? But we should do it wisely and discerning, right? There's a time to preach and teach the Bible to people, and there's a time to just show Jesus to people. And unfortunately, I think we have got this idea that, well, we're to just constantly bombard people with the gospel, right? We can bombard people with just what the Bible and what it says and all that, and that's not what we're called to do, right? You can't go to someone who's not a Christian and just give them Bible verses and expect them to follow the Bible verses. They're not a Christian. They don't believe in it. So why would they? So what good does it do to just go and hammer people with Bible verses all day long when they don't believe with it in the first place? And so, show them Christ, show them that, and that's what we're called to do, and that's what we need to do. And that's really, like, and it goes back to this to judging others as well. If we go around as Christians judging the world and condemning people in the world for living like the world, well, what good is that going to do? How are you going to win them over? How are you going to possibly win them over to Christ if you come with them with as a self-righteous attitude? And so that's what we need to make sure that we look at, and when we're teaching Christ, or more than anything, just the way we behave and the way we treat people is going to win over people more over to Christ, more than reading, giving them the Bible. They don't care what the Bible says because they don't believe in it. So why should we continue to show them who we are, show them who Christ is, and then they'll have an interest in it, and then we can sit down and discuss the Bible. So, just I wanted to throw that in there because he's talking about that, and I think that applies. And then he gets into Luke, right? He gets into Luke, or Luke, we get into Luke, and Luke talks about the kind of the same thing, right? He says in verse 37 and 38, don't judge others, again, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn others, or and it will not be come back against you. Again, kind of the same thing he said there. And then he says, forgive others, and you will be forgiven. Given you received, your gift will return in full, pressed down, shaken. Basically, whatever you give, it will be returned to you full in a much more greater sense than what you gave, right? And so what we see there in verse 37, 38 is that we have to have a forgiving spirit, right? That having a forgiving spirit demonstrates that we receive God's forgiveness, right? If we don't forgive others, God won't forgive us. He says that. And so we need to make sure that we do that, and that we show a forgiving attitude. I know that can be hard. It can be, if someone wrongs you, someone does something against you, it can be hard to forgive them. But we've got to make sure that we show that forgiving spirit. And in the end, if we are critical rather than compassion, we're going to also receive criticism, right? How often have you gone and criticized someone, and they return to you with compassion, right? Never. If you go to someone and criticize them, they're going to criticize you back, and that's the attitude that we got to make sure we don't have. Because if we treat people generous and graciously, right, and compassionately, then those are going to be returned to us. Like if you're not always, and but for the most part, if you're kind to people, if you help people, if you're compassionate and you show them empathy and you understand, like have an understanding of what they're going through, or maybe you don't even understand what you're going through, but you show them compassion anyways, and you do your best to help them through the best you can, they're going to see that, right? And they're going to respond. And like I said, not always, right? There's some people you can, you could bend over backwards for, and they're still going to stab you in the back. That's just the way the world works. But a lot of the times, if you are overly compassionate and you treat people with generosity and grace, they're going to see that, and it's going to be returned. And so we need to make sure that we do that. And then in verse 41 and 42, look, it says, he gets back again to the worrying about the speck in your eye, or in your friend's eye, or your person you know's eye, when you got a big old log in your eye. And I saw an illustration on that showed a big old log coming out of someone's eye, but he's using that to show the ridiculousness of, us trying to help someone or call someone out on their problem when our problem's tenfold. And we do that a lot, and we just got to be careful that we don't do that. And again, Jesus isn't saying ignore wrongdoing. He's not saying that, right? But he's saying we should not be so worried about other sins that we overlook our own. And that's the thing. I've seen that so many times, that people are so worried about calling out other people's sins that they ignore your own. Or the people can be really good about, what their main sin is, like, or what they really struggle with accusing other people of doing that when they're even not. I've experienced that as well. So we got to be careful not to do that, right? We often rationalize our own sins, and by pointing out the mistakes in others, and we want to. We know we struggle this. We don't want other people to see it, so we accuse others of doing it. Or if we see someone do it, we make sure we scream real loud about them doing it and let others know. And that's not a Christ-like attitude at all. We should be helping people with their sins. If they're struggling with something, we should be there helping for them, not calling them out and exposing them. And that's the judgment excuse me, that God is talking about here. We're to be helpful with people. If we see someone struggling, we're to help them. We're not to just sit and judge them and then call them out and be judgmental in our attitudes. So again, as a recap, just, we need to make sure that we show love to people, that we don't overlook sin, but at the same time, we don't just judge and condemn people and point out their sins the way that, especially to, distract others from our current sins. And so we need to make sure that we're not doing that. So again, I appreciate y'all watching. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe to our channel, please go ahead and do that. Like I said, I appreciate y'all, everyone who sticks around and watches these to the end. I hope that it's helpful. And if it is helpful, please share it with someone else. And as always, I appreciate you for watching.